Good evening to all of you. My name is Scott Appleby. I'm the Dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs. You're in Jenkins-Nanovic Hall, and half of this hall is Keough School offices and our 9 institutes and Global Policy Initiative, and the other half is Social Sciences. They probably told you that already. I really do mostly enjoy being a dean. One of my regrets in being a dean is that I haven't been able to spend 1 second with you folks over the last 3 days. And I actually, once upon a time, I used to read a little bit about religion and write a few things. So I would have loved to be part of this conversation. So I'd like you to have a moment of pity party for me right now that I couldn't do that. So I'm glad to be here and I'll be able to listen to the distinguished panel. Let me just say a few very brief opening remarks so we can really listen to what we have learned. I think that's what you're all going to address. So I didn't need to come to the 3 days because you 4 are going to just tell me what I need to learn. So let me begin with thanks. First and foremost to the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation that has sponsored this program and this series. This meeting today, these last few days, has been the first in a 3-part series that really is right in the center of what the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement Religion is all about, which is bringing different interlocutors together to have a deeper understanding of religion, and particularly within the Keough School's mission of advancing integral human development. How do we work together, religious and secular, and the co-imbrication of those identities? How do various religions and secular institutions and individuals and people work together for the common good, to end poverty, to reduce conflict, to advance the common good more generally? And so to bring together faith leaders, journalists, and scholars who are all concerned and engaged with these topics is just exactly what we do here at Ansari. And I'm very pleased that this is a kind of a highlight for our semester and our year going forward, to have you all distinguished guests come and participate in this. I want to thank our colleague Alex Hsu, who really worked so hard, as you know, to put these 3 days together. Yes, you can applaud him. We called upon to applaud him again at dinner, and the director, Mahan Mirza, who I'm going to stop there because I can keep naming names and we'll be applauding all night because it's a team effort to put an event like this together. I think you know, but just to repeat that we had a conference, when was it? The Religion Beyond Means conference. It seemed like another lifetime now. That is before the pandemic, right? It's a BP. It was a great conference that really opened this conversation about how to change the conversation about religion. It was held in DC. And this is a continuance moving forward deeper into this area. I could say a little bit more about the Keough School, but I'll just give you the 1-minute spiel. Or have you heard it already and you're ready for a quiz? You know what the Keough School is? That's not the logo. That's the Ansari logo. But very briefly, the Keough School was established by the Board of Trustees at Notre Dame in 2014, the first new school or college in about a century here at Notre Dame, to deepen the internationalization of Notre Dame. And we are not divided into disciplines as such or departments. We have 9 multidisciplinary institutes and centers that work collectively across the school to engage questions of human flourishing and integral human development. So we have institutes on peace and conflict, on democracy and development, on civil and human rights, on human development and global business, on global development on the ground. We have regional institutes, and of course the Ansari Institute, and they all work together. And we have PhD and master's programs and undergraduate programs at the school. So we're still very young, but growing rapidly. Happy to say more about that some other time. Finally, Mahan asked me to pronounce myself. He actually didn't, but I'm going to take the dean's privilege to do so in this last minute. On the question before you is, what should you emphasize in talking about religion and as you communicate about it? And is it the negative part of religion? Is it the positive part of religion? I confess I'm ambivalent about that question. That's a little joke, but I will say this: it's really just a joke that I would get, and it's not funny. But one thing, because I know you've had some intense discussions, I've heard some good engagement on this question of how to think about and report about and communicate about religion. And we know there's a lot of troubling things and negative things to say about religious presences in the world, and we can't ever deny or occlude them in any way. They are part of the larger, complicated mix of religion, which has so many constructive elements and dimensions we all know about. And that's really what the Ansari Institute emphasizes. It's not to deny the violence and the coercion, but to ask, if we go deeper, what is it that really engages religion in some of the most important work around the world for human development? So I like to say that with Catherine Marshall at Georgetown, that the World Bank used to say that somewhere between 40 and 70% of healthcare, delivery of healthcare in rural sub-Saharan Africa is delivered by Christian or Muslim groups. Well, if you're an economist at the World Bank, you think somewhere between 40 and 70%. What a puzzle. That's kind of a broad range. And the reason they're just guessing is they never counted religion until very recently, because religion fell off the secular map. That's changing a bit because there's more awareness, even in the secular halls of the World Bank, that religion is a complicated force for good. Complicated is worth noting. And I'll leave you with this. And I'm with colleagues like Paul Cooperman and Kathy Cummings and many others around the room who've written very insightfully on religion. And this is actually something that John Cavadini, of all people, said once that I've remembered about, not about religion, but about holiness. And I'll add a line. He said once in my hearing, holiness is hidden. Evil is often manifest. Holiness is hidden. And I would say holiness is hidden and strange. Literally, holiness is hidden and strange. It's a very powerful force in the world for good and for ill. But until we find a way to talk about the hiddenness of holiness and also its strangeness, which is not to say a normative statement about that, but it upsets our paradigms and norms and ways of understanding the world in complicated ways. So holiness is hidden and strange, and I expect a strange conversation right now. So thank you very much for being here.
You're not expecting any holiness.
Hello, my name is Adele Banks. I am the projects editor and national reporter for Religion News Service, and I'm very happy to be their moderator. I am one of more than a dozen participants for the last 3 days in Faith in the Story. Hindsight is 2020. It was a workshop of Notre Dame's Ansari Institute for global engagement with religion. So the four of us are going to talk a bit about our experiences here. Then we'll have our participants, other participants who are here in the front rows, weigh in. And then we'll open up the discussion to others who have joined us here, as well as those who are joining us online. So welcome if you're online. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Russell Johnson, faculty member at the University of Chicago Divinity School, who will give us a bit of a whirlwind tour of what our time together as journalists, scholars, and faith leaders has been like. Russell.
Thank you, Adele. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Faith in the Story, Hindsight is 2020. Whether you're joining via Zoom or in person, we're glad to have you here and have you be part of the conversation. But before you jump into the conversation, let me take a few minutes to bring you up to speed on what's already been said so far. When I look back on the events of the year 2020, there's a religious saying that comes to mind. That saying is, holy shit. When you Google 2020 events, feel free to do so, the first story that comes up is titled 2020 events, yep, these all happened in the year from hell. How's that for religion journalism? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's begin at the beginning. Abul Hassan shared a reading of the Quran in which Adam, the first human, was not punished so much as tested and given an opportunity to show off the divine task he had been given. Extending that analysis, she argued that the COVID-19 pandemic is not a punishment, but a test. And like all tests, an opportunity to demonstrate what we are capable of. The year 2020 may have felt like hell, may have felt like a punishment, but what if it was a test? The COVID pandemic tested the American healthcare system, tested our willingness to trust the scientific process in action, and of course, tested the bandwidths of Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, and Disney Plus. It also tested, as you'll remember, our nation's precious toilet paper supply chain, not to mention the Purell industrial complex. 2020 also tested faith leaders' ability to make sacred closeness happen in a socially distanced environment. The 2020 election and the contestation of its results tested American democracy and American faith in democracy, tested our news media, and tested the already strained threads that knit our social fabric together. In an increasingly polarized time, we all know division and conflict threaten to boil over, but we are also wary of facile attempts to unity as cries of peace, peace, where there is no peace. 2020 also saw, in greater strength than before, a movement agitating for Black lives and protesting against racial injustice. These events tested Americans' ability to listen and to act, tested the perseverance of Black Americans and their allies in the face of backlash and repression, tested all of our willingness to truly reckon with the legacy of racist policies, and tested our capacity to imagine a different social order. None of these three stories, I should note, are over. We are still in what we can call the long 2020. Although after the quarantine now, I expect we're all accustomed to time having no meaning whatsoever. 2020 has been a test for members of the three professions who have been gathered here for this conference: faith leaders, journalists, and academics. So what grade did our professions get on this test? A minus, C plus, F? And what have we learned from this experience in case we need to retake the exam? Or if we've been doom scrolling, is this the final exam? On a more hopeful note, as I said, if every test is an opportunity to demonstrate what you're capable of, what did we prove capable of in 2020? How did faith leaders, journalists, and academics step up to meet the challenges of this difficult year, especially when those challenges pertain to religion? These are some of the questions we will hopefully be discussing later this evening. In 2018, Professor Heidi Larson wrote, quote, "I predict that the next major outbreak, whether of a highly fatal strain of influenza or something else, will not be due to a lack of preventive technologies. Instead, emotional contagion, digitally enabled, could erode trust in vaccines so much as to render them moot. The deluge of conflicting information, misinformation, and manipulated information on social media should be recognized as a global public health threat," end quote. I'm sure Dr. Larson was able to say, "I told you so," to a lot of people since then, though I'm not sure she took much satisfaction in doing so. Our own Alan Levinovitz argued that journalists can sometimes be too gentle in correcting misinformation when that information seems religious in nature. We should take the kid gloves off and put the surgical gloves on if we want to dissect the myths that stand in the way of public health and safety. Anita Hauk suggested that humor provides a way to liberate people quarantined in their own bubbles of misinformation. The tradition of religious laughtivism that extends at least from the prophet Elijah to satirical prayers in the Renaissance to contemporary YouTube comedy shows. It shows how we can mock science in a disarming way. In my own presentation, I argued that criticism is often rendered ineffective because our minds tend to respond more out of a sense of loyalty to our own team than from a reasonable assessment of what needs to happen. Challenges to people's political, moral, and religious commitments need to juke between the various social cognitive defenders in order to get into the proverbial persuasive end zone. We are at Notre Dame, after all. Religion, as the dean mentioned, played an ambivalent role in 2020. President Trump held up a Bible for a photo op in DC while the scent of tear gas lingered in the air. But also President Biden cited St. Augustine in his victory speech. The streaming show Rami won a Muslim American a Golden Globe for Best Actor and earned accolades for Islamic representation. But also Muslim Congresswomen Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar experienced anti-Islamic prejudice from an even worse than usual Twitter. In our discussions, we talked about how the ambiguity of religion makes it difficult to speak honestly about religion without being misconstrued or misled. Alex Hsu said that we should not simply be a critic of religion or a cheerleader of religion, but rather we can be a caretaker of religion. We can hold up normative visions of what religious communities should be, while also naming the visible factions and invisible prejudices that descriptively exist within these communities. In a similar vein, Olivia Wilkinson argued that public health experts need to reckon with the complexity of religion, because there are dangers in instrumentalizing religious leaders to spread public health messages, but also dangers in allowing the narrative of religiously based vaccine opposition to drown out the many other narratives. What really works, she argues, are long-term partnerships between publishing outlets, experts, and religious leaders. Adele Banks and Matthew Kressler explained their own partnership over time. They worked together to give enough historical context to understand the difficulties of interracial churches in 2019 and 2020, but also enough contemporary relevance so readers can recognize their own voices and problems in these stories. 2020, as you all know, saw the 30th anniversary of the modern hip-hop classic Ice Ice Baby by Vanilla Ice, though weirdly, none of the journalists present wrote anything to commemorate this anniversary. Curiously. But the year did give us plenty of opportunities to stop, collaborate, and listen. Listening itself provided a real challenge in 2020, even when people remembered to unmute themselves on Zoom. Looking back at how reporters talked about religious groups who continued to meet in person at the height of the pandemic, Kelsey Dallas wishes that journalists had listened more and listened more closely to their voices and taken seriously some believers' willingness to take risks for the sake of communion and minyan. Risk is an essential part of the human experience, and questions of how to live in a risky world are questions religious believers have been asking for millennia. Chrissy Stroop talked about the unseriousness of many discussions of religion in 2020, and in particular, the unwillingness of some authors to listen to the voices that call religious practices like evangelism into question. I myself contribute to the unseriousness of religious discourse, but hopefully in a different way. Tiana Webb discussed how Black Americans are often pressured to sanitize and temper their rage at racialized injustice, and thought with her students about what spaces would look like where this rage could be fully expressed and fully heard. Years from now, when high school students take history tests about the year 2020, on their own exams, they will write about how wildfires got so bad that Elon Musk had to flee to space, how a parasite from Korea came to sweep the United States, and how murder hornets killed Alex Trebek. I'm assuming that these students didn't really do the reading that closely. 2020 was, and here I don't like to make value judgments, not a great year. As Alan Cooperman argued, the pandemic is causing existential insecurity, a feeling that we're all in jeopardy. Since increased existential insecurity seems to correlate with increased religiosity, it's possible one result of 2020 will be faith skyrocketing. Whether that's good news or not, there was certainly some good news in 2020. Richard Baker shared about his church's work to procure government-issued IDs and community IDs for immigrants and unemployed people so that they can get jobs. This ministry is part of a broader effort to push back against the misology and misanthropy, the hatred of reason and the hatred of humans, that can become our coping mechanisms in times of despair. Michael Neighbors narrated how his church in Evanston declared a war on racism, holding a series of intergenerational events to reckon with the history of his city and to remind people, old and young, that the best is yet to come. I think we can all agree, as the long 2020 comes to an end and my long introduction comes to an end, that the best is yet to come. So, in conclusion, have we passed the test? I got no idea. I don't know. But I have been grateful for this time of examination, and not just because it's been an opportunity for me to leave my house for once. Now I will hand it over to my colleagues, trusting that they will faithfully tell the rest of the story.
Thank you so much, Russell. That was an excellent summary. I'm glad that none of us are going to be tested on our coverage of the year of tests. I'll just say briefly that the workshop gave me as a journalist the opportunity to hear scholars and faith leaders and other journalists comment and also critique news stories. And it gave me food for thought about new and different ways to approach journalism. And I think it enlightened members of our three professions that are represented here and about aspects of our work that we may not have known or at least fully understood, including for me, how much journalism can be a teaching tool for the public as well as the academy. So another participant was the Reverend Dr. Michael C. R. Neighbors, Senior Pastor of Second Baptist Church in Evanston, Illinois. What would you like to add to the summary of our time together?
Well, let me say that if I was at Second Baptist Church in Evanston, what I would do is take a pastoral privilege and say, that was such a magnificent introduction that I will now give the benediction and we can all go home. I think Russell did a grand and outstanding job in being able to summarize what our 3 days was like together with these three disciplines coming together to talk about not only 2020, but to sort of capture it in the framework of our stories. What is our story? So one of the things that really came to light for me as we discussed and talked was a quote from Dr. King, who said that we are all caught up in a web of interdependence, that I cannot be everything God intended for me to be unless you are everything that God intended for you to be. And I think that really came to light in our discussion over the last 3 days. I've never been in a time frame that long with journalists and with the scholars to talk about our story, to talk about our faith. And so one of the things that I'm honored about is to have been able to sit and to listen to the importance of stories coming from individuals that I would have never met and that I would have never heard before. And I think that that is probably an important segue into whatever remedy we might be able to have in terms of moving from where we are to where we need to be. That we have to be able to sit down, engage in dialogue and discussion, sharing our own stories and being comfortable with that. And with that in mind, I think that one of the things that's really important is the listening aspect. One of the things that we were able to do very successfully, we didn't all agree on everything. I think that whenever you put scholars together, they may not agree on very much at all. And then whenever you put journalists together, they may not agree on very much at all. And when you put religious folks together, they may not agree on everything at all either, but they'll give the impression that they do. And so with that sort of multiplicity of diversity that existed, the thing that I came away from in terms of summarizing this is I came away with a sense of hope. That the real question is whether or not we have the capacity to fine tune what we were able to do over the last few days and to take it back to our respective communities. I thought about the number of clergy persons in Evanston that I'm familiar with who probably would have been just about completely uncomfortable in this kind of setting for one reason or another. And that's 100 different houses of worship. There may be 10 or 15 that would have been very comfortable coming out in this setting. So how do you take and articulate what we were able to accomplish about some of the most difficult issues in 2020 and come away with a kind of resolution or at least a sort of begrudging, healthy respect for one another in terms of learning what your perspective was and what you thought about it. So for me, again, I think what we were able to do in the Evanston community that I try to articulate with folks is we were able to bring together the congregation along with the community that we serve on one of the issues that then overlapped into the other issues as well. We came together to talk about race, and Russell talked about how we declared a war on racism that actually began in 2018, but that carried over to 2020 by designing and creating probably about 12.5 different activities and events during the year. The year started in person, and then in March, it moved to Zoom and live stream, but that did not diminish our ability to still reach out with the programs that we had designed. But we found out that after March, COVID-19 was just as important. So when we were talking about race, we then had to talk about health, and we had to talk about COVID-19. And one of the things that I didn't get a chance to mention with our group is that Second Baptist decided probably around April of this year, maybe a little before April, we decided that we would be the first house of worship in Evanston to host a vaccination event. And that was a very, very controversial thing. If you recognize earlier on during the year, houses of worship were not really doing that. And then some of the larger ones were doing it. We had to get together and communicate with the city of Evanston. We had to communicate with the health department for the state of Illinois. And we had to communicate with a healthcare provider, Evanston North Shore. We did that, and we came together, and we were able to give about 205 first vaccination shots to folks in the 1st of April. And then 30 days later, the second shot as well. That is taking a story and sort of in midstream, being able to add to your story and to take it away. And so I want to finish by saying, when I came into Notre Dame, I came in with a story that was my story. And my story has been very important to me all of my life. But when I heard the stories of the other people around the table, I recognized that my story is incomplete. And my story is incomplete because now I have to go back to the drawing board, and I have to include all of these lovely people that I met in my story, because your value, not only to this time together, but your value to humanity and to your profession is so seismic and so professional that it's made me a better person. And if I'm a better person, then I have to write that in a story. I have to go back and share that with the congregation at Second Baptist and with the members of the community as well. So you are going to be famous, at least in Evanston. So thank you very much. That's pretty much my perspective. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So another participant was Mr. Alan Cooperman, Director of Religion Research at Pew Research Center. Can you add a bit more to our overview?
Well, first of all, I want to say either amen or amen. I'm not sure. We joked about that a bit.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
To Michael's statement, and to also thank Adele and Russ for doing a great job. I want to start with what Richard called the astronaut's prayer. Please do not let me screw this up. It was a great session. And, as a Pew research person, you won't be surprised to know that I think there's some magic in numbers. Maybe the magic numbers for this were 3 days and about 12 to 15 people. Seemed to be just about the right amount of time to learn a lot, but not just to have the intellectual engagement with each other, but also to frankly open up a bit to each other, really see each other's personalities, and see everybody become comfortable in their own skins and a little bit vulnerable. And what we all agreed that what happened in this room would stay in this room. So I'm not going to go into great detail on any of that, but it was enlarging for me as a person. I really.
Alan Russell told it all.
He did.
He told it all.
He got a lot of it out there.
Sorry.
Let me be a little bit vulnerable and just talk about myself in 2020. It was indeed a hellacious year in lots of ways. We all ended up working from home. A lot of people ended up without jobs. Fortunately, I was able to keep my job and keep working with my staff, but a lot of our work was interrupted. COVID was a constant, of course, fear. Again, fortunately, I didn't get COVID, but my son did, and many people that I know did, and many of them, really suffered quite a bit. It was a difficult year politically. The polarization came to all of us, and climate change is a disturbing thing that we all had to reckon with in some degree or whatever. But none of that compared to me, for me personally, with the emotional wrenching need, pressing need to deal with race in America, or racial reckoning. I regret that I watched that George Floyd video. I regret it, but I'm glad that I did. That's all I can say. It was me. I've covered wars. I've seen people die in front of me. I've seen body parts. That was probably the most disturbing thing I've seen in my whole life. And honestly, the racial reckoning in America, how to deal with it, it's too big for me. And like all of us, I have a tendency to just put it aside, find out, overlook it, say a few things, but not really deal with it. And I think actually these 3 days helped me to deal with it in an emotional as well as an intellectual way. At one point, I wrote down a question for myself, and I will share it with you. It is, when do voices for reconciliation, bridging differences, civility, and tolerance become voices or become calls for quietism, inaction, and acceptance of the status quo? And I write that question and I posed it during the thing, but I really am taking it on as a self-criticism. Because very often, I will tell you honestly, I rhetorically, and probably even more than rhetorically, think of bridging differences and reconciliation and tolerance as kind of goods in and of themselves. And I was forced during these days to think more reflectively about that. But almost, I wouldn't say it was painful, but in a really, the discussions of violent rage and when violence is appropriate, if it is ever appropriate, they push some hot buttons, but they also made us think and enlarge ourselves. So I don't have the answers. It's a test that I haven't passed. It's a test we haven't passed as a nation, but for sure, we won't pass it as a nation unless we can come to grips with it, and not just intellectually, but opening our hearts to it and seeing other people. And so this was very meaningful to me. I'd like to thank the Ansari people for putting it together. Mahan did ask me to repeat one little bon mot from earlier, which is that even though I'm a person very devoted to quantification, I think that the biggest things that came out of this session probably can't be quantified, and that may be true in general in life. Don't tell the Pew Research Center I said this, but sometimes the most important things cannot be counted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. Sticking to our time, we'd like to next turn to what others who attended the workshop might briefly add to what we've already said. But for those members of the public attending here or online, I'd like you to start thinking about what you want to ask us. Those who are online can use the Q&A section within your Zoom connection. So would anyone in the first couple of rows who was part of the workshop very briefly want to say who you are and your title, and then briefly say something else that you came away with?
Very briefly, I'm Alan Levinovitz. I'm an associate professor at James Madison University. And this is, I'm just going to be very specific because I want to just be grateful to particular people for a particular thing. I've written in praise of intolerance, was an article I wrote for Slate. I've written a book about the limits of religious tolerance. I am generally speaking a fan of intolerance. I like truth, and truth excludes falsehood. And I'm especially grateful to Michael and Richard specifically, the two full-time faith leaders for, I don't know, this was also sort of emotionally difficult for me, but maybe because they're dealing with people all the time, and not at the front of a classroom, but people who suffer or need support. And I was just struck by how kind and gentle and affirming they were. And to the extent that their way of being was an argument for a kind of tolerance that I am constitutionally allergic to. they just really changed me. And so to be specific to two people, I'm really very grateful to both of you. So, and that was important to do in person, I guess, and important also to have these interdisciplinary or inter job connections.
Thank you, Alan. Who else would like to weigh in? Someone else, please.
Okay, I'm Matthew Kressler. I'm an associate professor of religious studies at the College of Charleston. And I'm actually I feel like the panel first and then Alan going next really, I think, gives everyone in the audience here on Zoom a sense not just of the content, but the character of our gathering together and how we've grown together as a kind of community of collaborators. I guess I was gonna pose kind of just very briefly pose a question to all of us, both participants, but everyone in the room and in attendance, that I think really emerged out of our conversations. Because it struck me kind of going over these 3 days that kind of at the heart of what we were wrestling with and not coming to kind of a single consensus on, but really wrestling with is, how do we live in and report on a diverse society if we're aiming to cultivate a pluralistic one? And then the follow-up question of what role does critique, does criticism, does kind of normative claims, does being the Jeremiah kind of speaking truth to power, what role does that have to play if the goal is to create a pluralistic society in a diverse community? And I don't think that we came to any answers, but I think that it was really one that left us all changed and very generative. So kind of as a kind of pairing to what you were saying, I was really struck, Alan, by an invitation to, I'm the one who's often kind of skeptical of talk of reconciliation and bridge building, and similarly have some questions around particular notions of tolerance. And I found myself kind of on the flip side being challenged to kind of think self-critically about how I approach the kind of writing and thinking that I do. So this was a real gift of a conversation.
Hi, I'm Kelsey Dallas. I'm a religion reporter at the Deseret News in Salt Lake City. And although it is my full-time job to write stories, write articles, what I realized in the past couple of days, there's not actually that much time for storytelling in the job that I do. That you're on the phone interviewing someone and it's like, just the facts, sir, just the facts, ma'am, what's your answer? I'm certainly not going to talk about myself because it's kind of a one-sided questioning. And so I was just reminded in the last couple of days, the joy of storytelling and learning about someone's context and their background and what made them who they are, and how being willing to share your own story in moments where it might make you vulnerable can be just so transformative in the moment.
Who else would like to share? Chrissy?
I'm Chrissy Stroop. I'm a columnist for Open Democracy and a senior correspondent for Religion Dispatches. And a lot of what I do is media criticism of religion coverage, trying to argue for the inclusion of voices that are often excluded, including former evangelicals or former conservative Christians who have certain insights, or people from marginalized groups who are often ignored in this kind of coverage. And I've written a lot of things about trying to understand pluralism as equal accommodation and how do we do that. And so I came in here with certain thoughts about pluralism and what it might take to have a more equitable conversational conversation about religion in America, which some of which I shared in my talk. But what I would like to just say about the conference is that this felt like the sort of engagement, not just with, but in pluralism, that I would like to say is, what I think is needed in the way that I understand that. It was just so heartwarming and enlarging, as many others have said. So thank you for this great opportunity.
I'm Abla Hassan. I teach Arabic language and culture for Nebraska University. And Russell, you started with a question whether we passed the test or not. And I like seeing ourselves laughing for 3 days and sitting together in a super friendly environment, trying to find ways to help ourselves and help everyone answer one of the most serious questions with the pandemic, like worst pandemic we've ever seen. I would say that not only we passed the test, but maybe with A+.
If anyone else wants to share who was part of the discussion, it would be great. If not, if anyone wants to speak about what happens next for them, and I think a lot of us really aren't sure yet. But if there's anybody who has in their mind, okay, I'm going back and I'm going to do this differently, or I'm going back and I didn't know this about clergy, or I didn't know this about scholars, or I didn't know about this about journalists. It'd be good to know what some of you took away that you learned from some of the other professions. So anybody on here or out there, please.
So one of the things that I learned, I want to say that in Evanston, you know, we're a community that is the first in the nation to have a municipal reparations resolution pass to the tune of $10 million over the next 10 years for African Americans. And that's been very exciting. We've been a part of a small group that has worked to make that happen since January of 2019. And the resolution passed by the City Council in the fall of that year. And in 2020, we had to stop all of our community meetings for the most part, and do everything through Zoom. And then this year, it just came out, and everybody in the world seemed to be interested in what was going on in Evanston with relationship to reparations. So because I was a part of a small group, I was interviewed. There were reporters and journalists calling from Russia and from England, and I had 75 interviews in 2021. And I want all of the journalists that I've become friends with to know that I now like journalists. Because there is a humane part of you that you just really can't quite get sometimes when you're talking on the phone and it's just the facts. And it became so difficult. And I think this is important for all of us when we go back to our respective communities, that our small group had to actually get a public relations firm to teach us how to talk to journalists. And you all may be interested in knowing that everybody passed with an A+ except the Baptist preacher. That public relations firm said I talked far too long and that I had to cut down my answers. I still haven't been able to do that. But I think what I'm saying is that learning so much and making friends with folks in different arenas than my own profession and background has garnered a healthy new respect. And I think we take that back to our respective communities, wherever we are, and maybe create a triage, you know, create a triage in Charleston, in South Carolina, in Lincoln, talk to clergy and scholars and journalists about what this big issue is with regard to people telling their story.
Russell and Ellen, I want to give you each an opportunity to share a bit more, perhaps, about what happened for you in 2020. That was a big issue and how you dealt with it.
Go for it. Yeah, so what comes to mind for me is that Pope Francis, as I'm sure many people in this room are aware, published an encyclical. In one of the things that it said was that digital relationships are not enough to connect a divided humanity, which is an interesting sentiment, but perhaps ironic, given the fact that this came out in October, I believe, of 2020, when for many of us, digital relationships were relationships at the time. So one of the things in sort of grappling with given how so many people think, okay, once we can just get off the internet and get in the same room together, that's how we're going to address polarization, realizing that, well, one, that may not entirely be accurate, and two, that also may not be entirely plausible. Some of the things that I've been thinking about in response to 2020 have been in regards to, okay, well, how are we going to, as a scholar of dialogue and disagreement, how are we going to think about the internet as the medium, the primary medium, I would say, through which we engage with news, events, politics, and and ethics in some regard. So one of the things that I'm doing starting in January, I'm teaching a class called Arguing on the Internet, and I'm definitely going to use some of the insights that we've talked about in this session to think about the ways that medium, both social media, which is my primary focus, but also online publishing, have in some ways contributed to the phenomenon that we're experiencing in our society today, but also are in some ways contributing to remedying and correcting and bridging and challenging some of the present illusions and myths that need to be challenged. I mean, I think neither many of the good stories of 2020 nor many of the bad stories of 2020 would have quite been what they were it not for the internet. And so that's the next step for me, is looking specifically at that.
Well, I guess I'll talk about bowling. Big surprise there. As I shared with my friends during this session, we have been at the Pew Research Center trying to track the impact of COVID, including its economic impacts on people, and at the same time, continuing to ask questions about their religious beliefs, practices, identities, and so on. Roughly a quarter of Americans say that their faith has been strengthened by the pandemic. Just 2% of Americans say their strength has been weakened by the pandemic. On the other hand, as I mentioned, the vast majority of those people who say their faith has been strengthened were already very religious people to begin with. And so if some of the theories that I shared, which I don't necessarily buy into, but if the existential insecurity theory, which correlates religion or religiosity with existential dread and insecurity, if that theory holds water, then we might expect a rise in religion, but I don't think we should expect a general rise in religion. I think rather that what we might well see, and it's a hypothesis, which I'm going to continue to explore in the United States and around the world, what we might well see is that people who are already relatively religious have turned to this as a source of resilience in their lives, and become even more religious, or religions become even more salient to them, to talk in those terms, while those who were not particularly religious have not turned to religion. There's been no rush into the churches. In fact, while we were sitting here over the last 3 days, the Pew Research Center released our latest figures on religion in the United States, showing that the share of Americans who identify as Christians of any flavor, not just Catholics, actually Catholics are pretty stable, but Christians are down, and down at a fairly rapid clip over the last 10 years. And the share who say they pray regularly is down, and the share who say they attend religious services is down, and the share who say that religion is important in their lives is down. So we are in a period of general secularization in the United States. Worldwide, as I noted, that's not the case. And it'll be interesting to try to track as best we can the impacts of the coronavirus on religion around the world. The other thing I'll mention is that this is the first physical gathering like this that I've engaged with. I did go to one previous physical conference just a month ago, but everybody was masked, everybody was socially distant, and it was not at all like this experience. While I would like to credit Ansari for bringing us together and creating the atmosphere that allowed us to become friends in a deep way in a relatively short period of time, COVID might also have something to do with that, because I think I was not the only one who was kind of eager to meet and talk with people in a way that I haven't been able to do for a couple of years. But it did also remind me my office is due to reopen sometime probably in late January. I mean, it's already physically open, but people are going to really start gathering there. And I'm really looking forward to that. This session made me think and made me resolve that when I meet with my colleagues, not that I hope I'm never merely instrumental in my relationships, but I'm eager to really double down on the personal side of the relationships I have with my colleagues. So those are two kind of resolutions for me of what I hope to do differently coming out of this.
Thank you, Alan. I'll take a moment to share a little bit about what I shared during the meeting, as well as I hope that everyone in the first couple of rows will think a little bit more if there's anything else they want to say before we go to questions in about 9 minutes from the public. So I felt motivated to write about the intersection of race and religion. Right before 2020, my news organization, Religion News Service, successfully proposed to Sacred Rights, a project that helps scholars share their research with a broader audience, that work with an expert on a series called Beyond the Most Segregated Hour. And the series is about integration and segregation in American religion. And Dr. Matthew Kressler of the College of Charleston and I produced an award-winning series that includes stories and a commentary in a total of 5 pieces that we focused on. They included topics such as reparations, challenges of multiracial churches for clergy of color, and solidarity of multi-faith coalitions who were seeking to meet needs in their local communities. And from that experience, I gained the knowledge that yes, journalists and scholars can, under some circumstances, be part of a collaboration, and a successful one, without compromising who we are as journalists and as scholars. And frankly, I think one of the things that's coming out of this gathering is figuring out what else can happen in that way, whether it's across 2 of the professions or 3. I think all of us are trying to figure out how that works with issues of trying to be fair and be ethical and all those things that come along with all 3 of our professions. So time will tell. But I'd like to know if any other people who are part of this few days together can talk any more about things that really rose to the surface for them, either what they're walking away with, what they want to do next as a result of our time together.
Alan, I agree that all the Notre Dame organizers and participants were wonderfully welcoming. And that really helped us to enjoy the friendships that we have enjoyed. But in particular, Peter set the tone right away with his comments about Notre Dame and the story, and a very candid and honest reflection on some of the struggles Notre Dame has had. And I think one of the things that left me with that I want to remember is that actually to admit shortcomings and failures and struggles can be both a sign of strength, but more importantly, open up possibilities for future growth.
Yeah.
And Peter, you really set that tone. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to add anything before we open it up to the others? All right. So the people who are in the room in particular, and then those online, we really would like to know what questions you might have for the participants. These could be questions not just for the 4 of us in front of you, but to any of the participants near the front of the room. I'd encourage you to ask questions that might be related to the different groups. You might just say what faith leader would like to answer this, or what journalist or what academic about their perhaps reflections on 2020 and what we hope to be looking at, speaking about, considering in 2022. So please ask.
Has news coverage of religion by the main secular papers, in the United States improved over the last, say, 10 or 20 years, do you think?
I hope so. There's a Religion News Association gathering that continues when we can meet, not during COVID times, but actually during COVID times, we've met remote on Zoom. And there continue to be dozens of reporters across the country who are able to gather at those kinds of meetings to try to help each other, encourage each other to improve. In addition to our working with our editors, Religion News Service is in a unique situation where we have a bunch of religion reporters working together. People like Kelsey Dallas have, not that quite that luxury, but still a newspaper that affirms the need for this kind of reporting. So I would say that overall, it has improved in some ways, but it has also expanded the people who do the beat, the people who write about religion. It's broader now. It's not just people at a mainstream paper or at a publication affiliated with, say, a religious group or a denomination. It's pretty much anybody who can have a blog and cares about religion. And that's good in some ways, but there would be some who say that means that the breadth of knowledge that's being shared is broader. There's some who will probably question whether some people really know what they're talking about. But I think overall, there is a continued emphasis on the need for this kind of reporting. And I hope that more and more of it can be good in part because of conferences like this.
May I add to that and just say that in tribute to the colleagues who are here and the broader community of religion journalists, which I'm no longer a part and haven't been for more than a decade. If they had merely maintained what they were doing 10 years ago, it would have been an absolute triumph, because the adversity, the conditions under which they're operating have so deteriorated. So you said 20 years ago, the Dallas Morning News alone had 5 full-time religion writers. 5. There's no newspaper in the country that has 5. The numbers who are operating as the equivalent of adjunct faculty, that is being paid by the piece, if at all, working essentially as freelance, those numbers have increased. All of this is well known. This is not, and the destruction of community newspapers all around the country has meant that the reporters who continue working at those places, whose numbers are far reduced, have much less time, especially for what is sometimes considered offbeat or non-news coverage, or at least not as pressing as covering the layoffs at the local factory or the local mayor's election or whatever other news might take precedence, rightly or wrongly, over religion reporting. So our colleagues who continue to do this work deserve a lot of credit just for their fortitude and bravery. And some of them have been at it a long time, like Adele. Adele has always done a good job, but really, 20, how many years have you been doing this? But I won't say long enough to know how to do it right. So.
Sure. I would want to distinguish between, to answer your question, between people who are reporting on religion, where there's been this decline of just resources and people doing it, but there's also been an explosion of punditry using religion, which is a separate thing. So if you look at op-ed pages or think pieces, everything's a religion. CrossFit's a religion. Anti-vaccines is a religion. This is something Russell touched on in his presentation. And so I think in that sense, the uncritical use of religion as like a hermeneutic lens is just at its peak. And it is the religion reporters who don't do that. But there is a lot of bad use of religion, like, oh, we don't understand this, it must be a religion, or I dislike this, but they believe it strongly, it's a religion, I guess. So I think that's a problem, and it's affecting public perception of religion in powerful ways. The fault of, I guess, media, but not religion journalists, which are two separate things.
Kelsey, would you be willing to add anything?
Oh, sure. The main thing that jumped into my head was just that I haven't been on the beat that long, the 20 years, but it used to be very institution focused, religion journalism in general. And I think partly because of social media and because of things like blogs, it's helped journalists get in touch with the internal conversations in denominations or congregations and really give voice to some of the amazing, challenging, frustrating complexities that exist in churches across the country. And so you end up with a lot more variety in the type of stories that are being told. And so it's not just like, here's this press release, here's this story. It's a lot of digging and uncovering.
Christy, would you have anything more to add?
Well, I do come at this from a pretty different angle, and one that might be a bit controversial at this conference, but the way that I see religion journalism, it seems to me that Christianity and white Protestantism in particular are treated with sort of kid gloves. And, previously there's been a reluctance in the legacy media to look at the dark side of religion, I think, in a serious way. We can all think of some very important exceptions, but where I see legacy media in particular improving over the course of 2019, 2020, 2021 is where they start to be willing to say things like, you know, there were a lot of Christians at the January 6th insurrection, and this is important and we need to think about it. I've been yelling at them to do that from the sort of the margins from these more, you know, sort of niche publications for a long time. I'd like to think that maybe I helped with that, but I don't really know.
Thank you. If all minds are clear on that question, Alex, can you tell us if there have been any chat Q&As at all? So could you start there, and then we'll go back to this room if others have questions. We're happy to hear from people here too. Okay, go right ahead first. Please tell us who you are.
I'm Paul Coleman. I teach theology here. I'm a fellow of the Ansari Institute, and it sounds like you all had a great time. I'm glad. Someone who's been here a long time, I'm really glad to hear that Ansari and the Keough School and the university were hospitable environments for you. I'm intrigued by the fact that all three of the major kind of vocational career areas represented by the participants depend on and contribute to publics that are fragile and shrinking and under certain kinds of pressures, whether it be learners in higher education, worshipers in religious institutions, or readers of regular journalism. And I'm intrigued to think about the way for those of you who participated that having all three of your groups of these vocations represented in a pretty robust way helped you think about making your publics more resilient and more robust and formidable. It's kind of a complex meta question, but it's what I've heard is what made me want to ask. So thanks.
Who would like to take that first? Resilience.
One of the things that emerged to me in our discussions is that there's, I mean, we've talked about it, a basic like media literacy problem, but it comes down to some really basic questions about like, how do journalists decides what stories they're going to write? How do the headline decisions get made? Why does this story get written this way and this one get written that way? And I used to talk about that quite a bit, like in a newsletter I would explain sort of the behind the scenes decisions that were made to create this article. And then it felt like, oh, that's just me trying to sound cool, or like nobody really cares about this. And in conversations this week, I just think that was abandoning that type of explanation or that effort was the wrong thing to do, because some of the reason why the readership might be shrinking or feeling lost is because they don't have the tools they need to understand what I'm trying to write or pick up a paper and feel comfortable browsing through it anymore. So I'm really thankful just to have some really basic conversations with folks here about what roadblocks are in their own way when it comes to reading journalism, because I'd love to talk all day about like the secrets of our profession, because they're not that juicy. It's just like really boring stuff.
Wonder if one of the other professions might speak to resiliency.
Well, yeah, the resiliency, that's the part that I was getting a little hung up on. But, you know, in terms of thinking about the ways that being in conversation with folks in journalism and folks in ministry, how I think of that impacting me as I go back to my life as an academic engaged in research or a teacher in the classroom. One of the most powerful things I think we did for me, I think it was the second day, I'm trying to remember, but we spent an extended period of time thinking across our respective fields about the art of storytelling, the different kinds of stories that we tell, the ways in which, or what a story is, and how story as genre has a kind of power in these different fields that we're in, and thinking quite critically and having some like quite heated kind of conversations about like what kinds of stories are effective or not, what kinds of stories invite people in to a space to think critically about themselves in the world, and what stories kind of shut people out or kind of immediately put people, thinking about some of what you were talking about today, Russ, like immediately put people into a kind of like aggressive and defensive, mode. And so I think of, I already kind of use kind of journalistic writing in my classroom, and I have already invited kind of ministers into the classroom to kind of guest speak, but like thinking, it kind of invited me to think more intentionally about how we're all engaged in kind of different arts of storytelling, and how that, does that make our students or classrooms more resilient? I mean, it's certainly kind of, I think, can invite students to see themselves in the work that we're doing, and I think that helps kind of build community. Yeah.
I think regarding houses of worship, and in response to your question, I really struggle with how we define and how we look at resilience. I think that resilience is normally looked at as being a positive, and remaining strong under fire and all of that. But there's a quote somewhere by some writer: "A foolish persistency is the hobgoblin of little minds." And I think that a resiliency, just for the sake of resiliency, just for the sake of survival, with regard to houses of worship, is not the direction that we want to go. I think that resiliency has to somehow include capacity for adaptation, capacity for change and transformation in the kind of world that we're living in. So we want to be resilient, but at the same time, we want to do so in this ever-changing society that we are in. And so I think resilience is a little bit different. And I think houses of worship have something built in, right? Historically, they just want to survive. And it's sad that the reality is that there are lots of houses of worship that I'm familiar with that had to close their doors over the last 2 years. And they had to close their doors because they weren't able to adjust to live stream, and having worship on the phone just wasn't doing it for a lot of folks. And I think that my empathy is for those of us who were able to adapt and survive. I wish that we would have been able to find ways to reach out to those smaller faith communities and to say, this is how you do it. We can help you get through this. And the reality is, for instance, I've spent a lot of time in Detroit. In Detroit, when I left in 2014, had about 3,000 churches. And people say, "Oh, that's so much. It's so many churches." Well, that if you compare it to the average membership, it was probably 27 or 28, because they're there's so many that are very small, but they're doing something. They're doing something in their community. They're doing something in their neighborhood, even in that small group. And I think we lost a lot of those. And I'm hoping that somehow resiliency within the context of houses of worship can be redefined, so that it's not just the individual house of worship that will be able to survive if they have all the resources, but we're able to reach out to the house of worship that's around the corner and around the block that nobody knows about. And you drive down the street 1,000 times, you didn't know there was a house of worship on that street, And so I think that's important for us. Resiliency, yes, but how do we define that?
Could I add just a tiny bit? Are we? Undoubtedly, the constituencies, broadly speaking, that we represent are feeling some of the pressures of technological and social change, but there's always another side to the story. And so quickly, just by the numbers, while it's true that roughly 30% of Americans today don't identify with any religion, the majority of those do say they believe in God, even of those who don't identify with any religion. And the share of Americans who identify with non-Christian religions is rising. And the share of Americans who identify with Christianity is still pretty whoppingly high number. Still talking 6 out of 10 Americans identify as Christians. If we think about journalism, while it's true that print subscriptions are down, the number of readers for the major legacy newspapers, at least the published figures, they've skyrocketed over the last 10 years with online subscriptions. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Wall Street Journal, they have more, and through the AP, Religion News Service, they have more actual readers than ever before. How much time people are putting into it, are they thinking? I don't know, because I can also tell you the other side of the coin is, you ask people where they get their news, and a lot of people will tell you from other people. So people don't even know where they're getting their information. Now, and quickly on congregations. Yeah, COVID shuttered the vast majority of congregations in the United States. In fact, one thing we talked about a little bit is that some of the coverage of the few congregations that were kind of resistant to closing the state open, they were a tiny number of congregations, really not representative. But I can tell you from our surveys, which absolute truth here, like T, capital T, truth. During the course of this pandemic, roughly a third of Americans were tuning in to religious services online. That's 85, this is adults, that's 85 million people. And more than half of those said they were doing it for the first time. And a lot of those people, so it's 18% overall of US adults, said they were doing that for the first time because of COVID. And many of those people, interestingly, were going to religious services, they told us in surveys, not just at the places that they previously went to physically, but at other places. And often at other places in addition to their own. So I would say that all three of these realms are changing. All three are certainly facing some pressures, but I would not say or not leave the impression, not that you did, Professor Coleman, but I would not say that they're, we're not doom scrollers. There were no doom scrollers in this room.
I just want to add to that, just some of it's anecdotal. I don't have all the research at my hand like Alan does, but some of the clergy I've spoken to have been really astonished during COVID that one, people are watching online and consistently and continuing to, and not just on the day that their worship happens, but over the course of the week, because there's that luxury now that you don't have to be there at 11 o'clock on the Sunday, for instance. And then also people are giving money. There's financial assistance that is continuing so that people maybe didn't have to let staff go, or were able to keep the pastor paid, which they didn't know whether they'd be able to. There's still some support. So somehow the bonds that were there when people were in person have continued despite everything. So.
And if I could add something from the pastoral side, Adele, absolutely right. That's been our experience, that the bonds have not been lost. We've been able to keep all our staff throughout the whole thing. And I would say 10 or 15 years ago, I would have said, if I have to read another article about mainline decline, I am just going to lose it. And of course, all those articles about mainline decline cited the Pew Research Center. Always. And of course, then the next day I get it in little white envelopes from my parishioners. What are you going to do about this, Pastor? But that was 10 to 15 years ago. And this conference has confirmed a shift that I felt myself and my congregation making over about the past 7 or 8 years. And that shift is, the future is open. There's a lot of complexity here. It's not a simple story. I mean, just what I could learn about what's behind the Pew Research has confirmed that. It's much more complex than a straight narrative of decline. The future is open. We've got a role to play. It's complex. And we have something valuable here. And we have to be faithful caretakers of it. Not critics, not cheerleaders, but caretakers. And I certainly feel that way about undergraduate liberal arts education. And I certainly feel that way about journalism and the free press. There's something valuable here. Let's not despair. The future's open and we have a role to play. And my congregation has been slowly moving there. And that's been a good thing. And this conference has really helped me to confirm that.
Alex, would you like to share from our virtual participants, please?
Hello, we're going to hear a little bit from our resilient public. I have both a comment and a question. A comment from Jane Pitts, who's tuning in. What an engaging conversation that must echo what the participants experienced while being together. What encouragement. No question in this. Keep on with letting us know the value of religion reporting. Be faithful to your consciences in writing. So thank you. Thank you, Jane. And a question from Spencer Neighbors. And this is in response to, I think, Professor Levinovitz's question way back when, or point. This is a great point about the hermeneutic use of, quote, religion, like CrossFit or anti-vaxxing. What does this type of hermeneutic usage mean with regards to the general or public epistemic understanding of religion? And the category of religion is something that we've talked extensively about, academic understandings of it, pastoral understandings of it, journalists' understandings of it. So I think they would like Professor Levinovitz to speak.
You also wanted to chime in on the previous one, so.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing up that point. It's one I think is really important. I guess what I would say, I said I was going to be gentle and nice, but I guess it's lazy. It's lazy, and it's because, as Russell said in his presentation, which I really thought was good, is it's when we don't understand someone, it's an easy way out. We can just use this way. We can say it's sort of like, oh, there's a serial killer. Well, why did they do it? They're crazy or they're evil, and that's it. There's this Wittgenstein quote where it's your spade is turned, and it's just a way to stop digging. You can just say, oh, it's a religion. That's why they do this thing that I don't understand. And so in the process of, and what's interesting to me, I think is really important, people do this who are religious. So you get, it's not a slur that's reserved for secular people. It's used as a slur by religious people. So you get, for example, conservative Christians calling wokeness a religion. And I'd like people to stop doing that, because I think it inhibits understanding and allows us to stop thinking hard about what it is we don't understand.
I love that distinction that you're making, Alan. And it strikes me in that distinction that there's a similar way that another word associated with another technical term in religious studies that is often bandied about, the word cult, is used in interesting ways that's analogous. And cult, I find, is often used as a way to kind of protect, quote unquote, good religion from bad religion. So, religion, Alan, is rightly noting, is like used to kind of like dismiss things that we don't want to have to reckon with. And cult is often a way to say, like, well, they're not doing religion right. So we can similarly use the word cult, and that means that we don't have to talk about it anymore, or we don't have to reckon with how it relates to these broader religious kind of relationships and traditions that they're coming out of. So it's a really important point. Yeah.
People who have attended this conference the last few days will probably understand the significance of the statement I'm about to make in a way that maybe those watching at home or those who haven't been here might not, but I agree with Alan. This use of religion is a lazy trope. And I think, as a media critic, I think a lot about lazy tropes and unexamined assumptions. But I want to add one piece of context, which when Alan said, conservative Christians are calling wokeness a religion, for example, conservative Christians, particularly evangelical Protestants, operating with a certain understanding of apologetics, actually have been for a very long time calling everything they don't like a religion, because they tend to think in terms of binaries, black and white, everything is spiritual warfare. So public schools are not explicitly Protestant. Well, therefore, they're indoctrinating children in the religion of secular humanism. They actually use this argument to advocate for homeschooling, extremist versions of homeschooling and Christian education, for example. They call being transgender a religion, which is interesting to me as a transgender woman. So yeah, that's a whole thing that we could go into, but we probably shouldn't.
Hi, I'm Kathy Cummings. I teach in the history and American Studies departments here, and I direct the Kushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism. And I got to sit in on just a few of the sessions. I was so moved, Adele and Matthew, by your collaboration. This was an article that I had read when it was published, but I got to hear about the genesis of this article, and Matthew actually put up emails, email exchanges about the process back and forth, and shared about the common language. And I am familiar with sacred rights, and I think it's wonderful. The question I'd like to put to both of you, and I think to the professors who are presenting, is about I guess reward structures for, I mean, you've talked about the power of the story. We know this is a good thing to do. As you made clear, that collaboration was a lot of work. And in a profession where the coin of the realm is the published, the scholarly publications, I'd like to just talk about, do you feel recognized for that in your profession? And is sacred rights, is that something sacred rights helps scholars do? Make the case. We have a dean in the room. I'd like to hear from him as the dean of a school that encourages the public facing scholarship. How are you supported? I know Pete and I were trying to squeeze in a meeting today about a project. He's a faculty member too. So I just like to hear some reflections on that.
Yeah, thank you. Google Sacred Rights if you're in the audience or you haven't heard of it before, because it's a really incredible program. And what Sacred Rights allowed Adele and I to do was that it funded our work. So it meant that our kind of like collaboration wasn't a kind of pro bono time away from our workaday jobs, but was a kind of a job. For me as a scholar, it made this kind of collaboration legible, meaning that like in my CV, I could put under the fellowship part that I had a Sacred Rights Fellowship, which is legible in a way that's different than, I simply published these articles with Religion News Service. But I was sharing in our workshop that part of there, a number of different stars and planetary bodies had to align for this to be something that I could do with minimal risk. So I was far enough along in the process toward tenure. I had gotten my book and some articles done. I had funding. It was a, the list goes on and on. And so I think that, if anything, I think that what Sacred Rights is doing, and I think what we're doing, by bringing these three constituencies together with the generosity of the Ansari Institute and foundations supporting them, is really essential, because kind of connected to the question of resilience. I mean, I think that that scholars, just speaking from the perspective of a scholar, I think engaging in public facing work is really part of the future of the discipline. It's demonstrating, particularly for those of us in the humanities and social sciences, it's demonstrating our relevance, our significance, our kind of critical contributions to society, to a democracy. And so I think that it's something that should be valued institutionally. I think that it necessitates a shift among academics, among colleagues and sometimes administrators, to think differently about what achievement looks like and how we evaluate and assess these things. But I think it's necessary.
Before we let Dean Appleby perhaps answer this question, I just want to mention that the Sacred Rights Partnership also helped me travel to do some of the work we were doing, which is always a challenge for journalists to have money to travel. For instance, I had gone to a conference in Dallas, but that was kind of planned ahead of time and was really a spark for a lot of us. I went to a conference called Mosaics that dealt with clergy intentionally trying to have multiracial, multi-ethnic congregations. But I also went to a one-day conference in Cincinnati. And from that, I got to quote a pastor who fit the category called estranged pioneers that a scholar has come up with about clergy of color who either feel dissed by the white leaders that they're in a congregation with, who don't really give them power and a chance, and also dismissed by people who were of their own racial ethnic group, who didn't understand why they were leaving a congregation of a predominant race or ethnic group to go to a multiracial congregation they felt called to lead. So that's one other point. I also want to make sure people know that Sacred Rights is WRITES. If you want to look it up, they're on Twitter and they're also on the web. So we have 5 minutes to go. And Dean Appleby, would you like to add anything more?
I can't say my name in 5 minutes. I'm not a succinct speaker, but I'll say something very quickly. The academy is slow to change in some ways, but there has been some change on this front. It's still the case that in some parts of Notre Dame there is a sense that what you've collaborated with a journalist, you collaborated with a faith leader. Let's just not talk about that. But there has been progress in other places in this university and elsewhere that is not quite where I think we want to be. And that is that sometimes as certain faculty are reviewing their CV and putting themselves up for promotion, they will be able to put these kind of collaborations into the category of service. And that's actually a step forward. That is, okay, it's not research. Let's be clear about that. And it doesn't really fit into teaching, but it's kind of being a public intellectual, wait a second, part of service. And so you put that into the service category, which traditionally has been, third, a distant third. But I would say that in the Keough School and other parts of the university, and again, there's some people in this room whose collaboration with journalists, with faith leaders, with others, and whose public intellectual work is highly valued and really does belong in their portfolio at the highest level. Because as you know, I think the Academy has begun to recognize there have been political pressures in this direction, funding pressures. What are you doing that's relevant? Why are you studying that village in Florence in the 14th century? What is that doing about our bottom line here? That's one pressure. There's some other pressures, but it's all led to a good outcome, which is we're supposed to be educators. And that means we're supposed to translate our research for broader and broader publics. And that's why we're particularly proud of the growing number of people here at Notre Dame who are publicly prominent, public intellectuals, and do very good work. And we consider that part really of research, teaching, and service because it's ultimately rooted in their research. It's part of the educational mission, and it is public service. So we're getting there. Things don't change as quickly as you'd like, but I'd like to think we're headed in the right direction.
Thank you. Are all minds clear? Does anybody else want to add anything? I just want to say that this experience helped each of us realize that we're each human beings, which I think sometimes people forget when you think of, oh, that journalist over there, or oh, that scholar over there, or oh, that clergy person or faith leader. And that really is part of what we got to discover over the past few days, even though it should be obvious, it's not necessarily. So I think our discussion sessions were focused on news stories, but we also got to hear the stories of scholars and the stories of faith leaders and understand each other better than we may have a few days ago. So hopefully we will learn from what we did for the last few days and bring new perspectives that we can share with others in all three of our professions as we go forward. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.